Viking expansion. Viking expansion was a historical movement which led Norse explorers, traders, and warriors, the latter known in modern scholarship as Vikings, to sail most of the North Atlantic, reaching south as far as North Africa and east as far as Russia, and through the Mediterranean as far as Constantinople and the Middle East, acting as looters, traders, colonists, and to the west. Vikings under Leif Erikson, the heir to Erik the Red, reached North America and set up a short-lived settlement in present-day Meadows, Newfoundland, Canada. Longer-lasting and more established Norse settlements were formed in Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Russia, Great Britain, Ireland, and Normandy. It is debated whether the term Viking represents all Norse settlers or just those who raided. Motivation for expansion. There is much debate among historians about what drove the Viking expansion. Researchers have suggested that Vikings may have originally started sailing and raiding due to a need to seek out women from foreign lands. The concept was expressed in the 11th century by historian Dudo of St. Quentin in his semi-imaginary History of the Normans. Rich and powerful Viking men tended to have many wives and concubines, and these polygynous relationships may have led to a shortage of eligible women for the average Viking male. Due to this, the average Viking man could have been forced to perform riskier actions to gain wealth and power to be able to find suitable women. Viking men would often buy or capture women and make them into their wives or concubines. Polygynous marriage increases male-male competition in society because it creates a pool of unmarried men who are willing to engage in risky status-elevating and sex-seeking behaviors. The Annals of Ulster states that in 821 the Vikings plundered an Irish village and carried off a great number of women into captivity. Another theory is that it was a quest for revenge against continental Europeans for past aggressions against the Vikings and related groups. Charlemagne's campaign to force Saxon pagans to convert to Christianity by killing any who refused to become baptized in particular. Those who favor this explanation point out that the penetration of Christianity into Scandinavia caused serious conflict and divided Norway for almost a century. However, the first target of Viking raids was not the Frankish kingdom, but Christian monasteries in England. According to the historian Peter Sawyer, these were raided because they were centers of wealth and their farms well stocked, not because of any religious reasons. A different idea is that the Viking population had exceeded the agricultural potential of their homeland. This may have been true of western Norway, where there were few reserves of land, but it is unlikely that the rest of Scandinavia was experiencing famine. Alternatively, some scholars propose that the Viking expansion was driven by a youth bulge effect, because the eldest son of a family customarily inherited the family's entire estate. Younger sons had to seek their fortune by emigrating or engaging in raids. Peter Sawyer suggests that most Vikings emigrated due to the attractiveness of owning more land rather than the necessity of having it. However, no rise in population, youth bulge, or decline in agricultural production during this period has been definitively demonstrated. Nor is it clear why such pressures would have prompted expansion overseas rather than into the vast, uncultivated forest areas in the interior of the Scandinavian peninsula, although perhaps emigration or sea raids may have been easier or more profitable than clearing large areas of forest for farm and pasture in a region with a limited growing season. It is also possible that a decline in the profitability of old trade routes drove the Vikings to seek out new, more profitable ones. Trade between Western Europe and the rest of Eurasia may have suffered after the Roman Empire lost its western provinces in the 5th century, and the expansion of Islam in the 7th century may have reduced trade opportunities within Western Europe by redirecting resources along the Silk Road. Trade in the Mediterranean was at its lowest level in history when the Vikings began their expansion. The Viking expansion opened new trade routes in Arab and Frankish lands, and took control of trade markets previously dominated by the Frisians after the Franks destroyed the Frisian fleet. Settlement demographics. Viking settlements in Ireland and Great Britain are thought to have been primarily male enterprises. However, Disagreement is partly due to method of classification. Previous archaeology often guessed biological sex from burial artifacts, whereas modern archaeology may use osteology to find biological sex and isotope analysis to find origin. DNA sampling is usually not possible. The males buried during that period in a cemetery on the Isle of Man had mainly names of Norse origin, while the females there had names of indigenous origin. Irish and British women are mentioned in old texts on the founding of Iceland, indicating that the Viking explorers were accompanied there by women from the British Isles who either came along voluntarily or were taken along by force. Genetic studies of the population in the Western Isles and Isle of Skye also show that Viking settlements were established mainly by male Vikings who mated with women from the local populations of those places. However, not all Viking settlements were primarily male. Genetic studies of the Shetland population suggest that family units consisting of Viking women as well as men were the norm among the migrants to these areas. This may be because areas like the Shetland Islands, being closer to Scandinavia, were more suitable targets for family migrations, while frontier settlements further north and west were more suitable for groups of unattached male colonizers. British Isles, Fish Isles, England. During the reign of King Beorhtric of Wessex, 786–802, 3 ships of Northmen landed at Portland Bay in Dorset. The local reeve mistook the Vikings for merchants and directed them to the nearby royal estate, but the visitors killed him and his men. The earliest recorded planned Viking raid, on 6 January 793, targeted the monastery of the island of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of Northumbria. According to the 12th century Anglo-Norman chronicler Simeon of Durham, the raiders killed the resident monks or threw them into the sea to drown or carried them away as slaves along with some of the church treasures. In 875, in 794, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a small Viking fleet attacked a rich monastery at Jarrow. The Vikings met with stronger resistance than they had expected. Their leaders were killed. The raiders escaped, only to have their ships beached at Tynemouth and the crews killed by locals. This represented one of the last raids on England for about 40 years. The Vikings focused instead on Ireland and Scotland. In 865, a group of hitherto uncoordinated bands of predominantly Danish Vikings joined together to form a large army and landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described this force as the Mysel heathen here great heathen army and went on to say, the army crossed the Midlands into Northumbria and captured York Jorvik. In 871, the Great Heathen Army was reinforced by another Danish force, known as the Great Summer Army led by Guthrum. In 875, the Great Heathen Army split into 2 bands, with Guthrum leading one back to Wessex, and Halfdan taking his followers north. Then in 876, Halfdan shared out Northumbrian land amongst his men, who ploughed the land and supported themselves, founding the territory later known as the Danelaw. Most of the English kingdoms, being in turmoil, could not stand against the Vikings, but King Alfred of Wessex defeated Guthrum's army at the Battle of Edington in 878. There followed the Treaty of Wedmore the same year, and the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum in 886. These treaties formalized the boundaries of the English kingdoms and the Viking Danelaw territory, with provisions for peaceful relations between the English and the Vikings. Despite these treaties, conflict continued on and off. However, Alfred and his successors eventually drove back the Viking frontier and retook York. A new wave of Vikings appeared in England in 947 when Eric Bloodaxe captured York. The Viking presence continued through the reign of the Danish prince Sinup the Great reigned as King of England, 1016–1035, after which a series of inheritance arguments weakened the hold-on power of Sinup's heirs. When King Edward the Confessor died in 1066, the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada challenged his successor as King of England, Harold Godwinson. Hardrada was killed, and his Norwegian army defeated, by Harold Godwinson on 25 September 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Harold Godwinson himself died when the Norman William the Conqueror defeated the English army at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066. William was crowned King of England on 25 December 1066, however, it was several years before he was able to bring the kingdom under his complete control. In 1070 the Danish king Sweyn Estridsson sailed up the Humber with an army in support of Edgar the Atheling, the last surviving male member of the English royal family. However, after capturing York, Sweyn accepted a payment from William to desert Edgar. 5 years later, one of Sweyn's sons set sail for England to support another English rebellion, but it had been crushed before the expedition arrived, so they settled for plundering the city of York and the surrounding area before returning home. In 1085 Sweyn's son, now Canute Roman IV of Denmark, planned a major invasion of England, but the assembled fleet never sailed. No further serious Danish invasions of England occurred after this. Although some raiding occurred during the troubles of Stephen's reign, when King Eystein Roman II of Norway took advantage of the civil war to plunder the east coast of England, sacking Hartlepool and Whitby in 1152, as well as raiding the Yorkshire coast. However, the intention was raids, not conquest, and their conclusion marked the end of the Viking Age in England. Scotland. The monastery at Iona on the west coast was first raided in 794 and had to be abandoned some 50 years later, after several devastating attacks. While there are few records from the earliest period, it is believed that Scandinavian presence in Scotland increased in the 830s. The Isles to the north and west of Scotland were heavily colonized by Norwegian Vikings. Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides came under Norse control, sometimes as fiefs under the King of Norway, and at other times as separate entities under variously the Kings of the Isles, the Earldom of Orkney, and the later Kings of Man and the Isles. Shetland and Orkney were the last of these to be incorporated into Scotland in as late as 1468. Wales. Wales was not colonized by the Vikings as significantly as eastern England. The Vikings did, however, settle in small numbers in the south around St. David's, Haverfordwest, and the Gower. Place names such as Stockholm, Skolmer, and Swansea remain as evidence of the Norse settlement. The Vikings, however, were not able to set up a Viking state or control Wales, owing to the powerful forces of Welsh kings, and, unlike in Scotland, the aristocracy was relatively unharmed. Nevertheless, following the successful Viking alliance with Brittany in 865, although the Welsh had been longtime enemies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, their relationship with the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex was somewhat warmer. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of 893, for example, refers to Vikings being pursued by a combined force of West Saxons and North Welsh along the River Severn. The combined Anglo-Saxon and Welsh army eventually overtook the Vikings before defeating them at the Battle of Buttington. The city of Swansea was founded by Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, who by 1013 was king of the Danes, Anglo-Saxons, and Norwegians. The English name for the town derives from Old Norse, Sveinsey, meaning either Swain's Island or Swain's Inlet. See Swansea. The neighboring Gower Peninsula has some place names of Norse origin. For example, Worm's Head is from Old Norse, ormur, the word for snake or dragon, as the Vikings believed that the serpent-shaped island was a sleeping dragon. Some 20 miles 32 kilometers west of Cardiff on the Vale of Glamorgan coast is the semi-flooded island of Tusker Rock, which takes its name from Tuska, the Viking who established a settlement in the area. Cornwall. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported that heathen men the Danes raided Charmouth, Dorset in 833 AD, then in 997 AD they destroyed the Dartmoor town of Lidford, and from 1001 AD to 1003 AD they occupied the old Roman city of Exeter. The Cornish were subjugated by King Aethelstan of England in 936 and the border finally set at the River Tamar. However, the Cornish remained semi-autonomous until their annexation into England after the Norman conquest. Ireland. In 795, small bands of Vikings began plundering monastic settlements along the coast of Gaelic Ireland. The annals of Ulster state that in 821 the Vikings plundered Howth and carried off a great number of women into captivity. From 840 the Vikings began building fortified encampments, long forts, on the coast and overwintering in Ireland. The first were at Dublin and Linduachale. Their attacks became bigger and reached further inland, striking larger monastic settlements such as Armagh, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Kells and Kildare, and also plundering the ancient tombs of Brú na Bóinne. Viking chief Thorgest is said to have raided the whole Midlands of Ireland until he was killed by Mercenaries in 845. In 853, Viking leader Leif Olaf became the first king of Dublin. He ruled along with his brothers Imar, possibly Ivar the Boneless, and Oil. Over the following decades, there was regular warfare between the Vikings and the Irish, and between two groups of Vikings, the Dubgail and Fingail, dark and fair foreigners. The Vikings also briefly allied with various Irish kings against their rivals. In 866, Eadfine Findlaith burnt all Viking long forts in the north, and they never managed to establish permanent settlements in that region. The Vikings were driven from Dublin in 902. They returned in 914, led by the Uiamere House of Ivar. During the next 8 years, the Vikings won decisive battles against the Irish, regained control of Dublin, and founded settlements at Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, which became Ireland's first large towns. They were important trading hubs, and Viking Dublin was the biggest slave port in Western Europe. These Viking territories became part of the patchwork of kingdoms in Ireland. Vikings intermarried with the Irish and adopted elements of Irish culture, becoming the Norse Gaels. Some Viking kings of Dublin also ruled the kingdom of the Isles and York, such as Sitrick Keach, Gofraid Uimer, Olaf Guthfrithson, and Olaf Cuaran. Sitrick Silkbeard was a patron of the arts, a benefactor of the church, and an economic innovator who established Ireland's first mint in Dublin. In 980, Mael Sechnaill Mór defeated the Dublin Vikings and forced them into submission. Over the following 30 years, Brian Boru subdued the Viking territories and made himself High King of Ireland. The Dublin Vikings, together with Leinster, twice rebelled against him, but they were defeated in the battles of Glenmama 999 and Clontarf 1014. After the Battle of Clontarf, the Dublin Vikings could no longer single-handedly threaten the power of the most powerful kings of Ireland. Brian's rise to power and conflict with the Vikings is chronicled in Cogad Gedal Rí Galaib, the War of the Irish with the Foreigners. European mainland. Normandy. Normandy. The name of Normandy itself denotes its Viking origin, from Northmania or land of the Norsemen. The Viking presence in Normandy began with raids into the territory of the Frankish Empire from the middle of 9th century. Viking raids extended deep into the Frankish territory and included the sacking of many prominent towns such as Rouen, Paris, and the abbey at Jumièges. The inability of the Frankish King Charles the Bald and later Charles the Simple to prevent these Viking incursions forced them to offer vast payments of silver and gold to prevent any further pillage. These payoffs were short-lived, and the Danish raiders would always return for more. The Duchy of Normandy was created for the Viking leader Rollo after he had besieged Paris. In 911, Rollo entered vassalage to the king of the West Franks Charles the Simple through the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte. This treaty made of Rollo the first Norman Count of Rouen. In addition, Rollo was to be baptized and marry Giselle, the illegitimate daughter of Charles. In exchange for his homage and fealty, Rollo legally gained the territory which he and his Viking allies had previously conquered. The descendants of Rollo and his followers adopted the local Gallo-Romance languages and intermarried with the area's original inhabitants. They became the Normans, a Norman French-speaking mixture of Scandinavians and indigenous Franks and Gauls. The language of Normandy heavily reflected the Danish influence as many words, especially ones pertaining to seafaring, were borrowed from Old Norse or Old Danish. More than the language itself, the Norman toponymy retains a strong Nordic influence. Nevertheless, only a few archaeological traces have been found, swords dredged out of the Seine River between its estuary and Rouen, the tomb of a female Viking at Pitters, the two Thor's hammers at St. Pierre de Varengeville and Sahars, and more recently the hoard of Viking coins at St. Pierre des Flours. Rollo's descendant William, Duke of Normandy the Conqueror, became King of England after he defeated Harold Godwinson and his army at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066. As King of England, he retained the fiefdom of Normandy for himself and his descendants. The kings of England made claim to Normandy as well as their other possessions in France, which led to various disputes with the French. This culminated in the French confiscation of Gascony that precipitated what became known as the Hundred Years' War in 1337. West Francia and Middle Francia. West Francia and Middle Francia suffered more severely than East Francia during the Viking raids of the 9th century. The reign of Charles the Bald coincided with some of the worst of these raids, though he did take action by the Edict of Pisters of 864 to secure a standing army of cavalry under royal control to be called upon at all times when necessary to fend off the invaders. He also ordered the building of fortified bridges to prevent inland raids. Nonetheless, the Bretons allied with the Vikings, and Robert, the Margrave of Neustria, a march created for defence against the Vikings sailing up the Loire, and Ranulf of Aquitaine died in the Battle of Brisard in 865. The Vikings also took advantage of the civil wars which ravaged the Duchy of Aquitaine in the early years of Charles' reign. In the 840s, Pepin Roman too called in the Vikings to aid him against Charles, and they settled at the mouth of the Garonne as they did by the Loire. Two dukes of Gascony, Seguin Roman II and William I, died defending Bordeaux from Viking assaults. A later duke, Sancho Matera, even settled some at the mouth of the Adur near Bayonne in an act presaging that of Charles the Simple, and the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, by which the Vikings were settled in Rouen, creating Normandy as a bulwark against other Vikings. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Vikings raided the largely defenceless Frisian and Frankish towns lying on the coast and along the rivers of the Low Countries. Although Vikings never settled in large numbers in those areas, they did set up long-term bases and were even acknowledged as lords in a few cases. They set up bases in St. Florent, La Ville at the mouth of the Loire, in Tailleberg on the Mid-Charente, also around Bayonne on the banks of the Adur, in Noirmoutier, and obviously on the river Seine-Rouen in what would become Normandy. Antwerp was raided in 836. Later, there were raids of Ghent, Kortrijk, Tournai, Leuven, and the areas around the Meuse River, the Rhine, the Rupel River, and the tributaries of those rivers. Raids were conducted from bases established in Asselt, Walcheren, Wieringen, and Elterberg or Eltenburg, a small hill near Elten. In Dutch and Frisian historical tradition, the trading centre of Dorstad declined after Viking raids from 834 to 863, however, since no convincing Viking archaeological evidence has been found at the site as of 2007, doubts about this have grown in recent years. One of the more important Viking families in the Low Countries was that of Rorik of Dorstad, based in Wieringen, and his brother Harold, based in Walcheren. Around 850, Lothair I acknowledged Rorik as ruler of most of Friesland. Again, in 870, Rorik was received by Charles the Bald in Nijmegen, to whom he became a vassal. Viking raids continued during this period. Harold's son Rodolf and his men were killed by the people of Oostergo in 873. Rorik died sometime before 882. Buried Viking treasures consisting mainly of silver have been found in the Low Countries. Two such treasures have been found in Wieringen. A large treasure found in Wieringen in 1996 dates from around 850 and is thought perhaps to have been connected to Rorik. The burial of such a valuable treasure is seen as an indication that there was a permanent settlement in Wieringen. Around 879, Godfred arrived in Frisian lands as the head of a large force that terrorized the Low Countries. Using Ghent as his base, they ravaged Ghent, Maastricht, Liege, Stavelot, Prum, Cologne, and Coblentz. Controlling most of Frisia between 882 and his death in 885, Godfred became known to history as Godfred, Duke of Frisia. His lordship over Frisia was acknowledged by Charles the Fat, to whom he became a vassal. In the siege of Asselt in 882, the Franks sieged a Viking camp at Asselt in Frisia. Although the Vikings were not forced by arms to abandon their camp, Godfred was assassinated in 885, after which Geralf of Holland assumed lordship and Viking rule of Frisia came to an end. Viking raids of the Low Countries continued for over a century. Remains of Viking attacks dating from 880 to 890 have been found in Zutphen and Deventer. The last attacks took place in Tyle in 1006 and Utrecht in 1007. Iberian Peninsula. Compared with the rest of Western Europe, the Iberian Peninsula seems to have been little affected by Viking activity either in the Christian north or the Muslim south. In some of their raids on Iberia, the Vikings were crushed either by the Kingdom of Asturias or the Emirate armies. Our knowledge of Vikings in Iberia is mainly based on written accounts, many of which are much later than the events they purport to describe, and often also ambiguous about the origins or ethnicity of the raiders they mention. A little possible archaeological evidence has come to light, but research in this area is ongoing. Viking activity in the Iberian Peninsula seems to have begun around the mid-9th century as an extension of their raids on and establishment of bases in Frankie. The most prominent and probably most significant event was a raid in 844 when Vikings entered the Garonne and attacked Galicia and Asturias. When the Vikings attacked La Corne, they were met by the army of King Ramiro I and were heavily defeated. Many of the Vikings' casualties were caused by the Galicians' ballistas, powerful torsion-powered projectile weapons that looked rather like giant crossbows. 70 of the Vikings' longships were captured on the beach and burned. They then proceeded south, raiding Lisbon and Seville. This Viking raid on Seville seems to have constituted a significant attack. The period from 859 to 861 saw another spate of Viking raids, apparently by a single group. Despite some elaborate tales in late sources, little is known for sure about these attacks. After raids on both northern Iberia and Al-Andalus, one of which in 859 resulted in the capture and exorbitant ransom of King Garcia Iniguez of Pamplona, the Vikings seem also to have raided other Mediterranean targets, possibly. Evidence for Viking activity in Iberia vanishes after the 860s until the 960s-70s, when a range of sources, including Dudo of St. Quentin, Ibn Hayyan, and Ibn Idhari, along with a number of charters from Christian Iberia, while individually unreliable, together afford convincing evidence for Viking raids on Iberia. 10th or 11th century fragments of mouse bone found in Madeira, along with mitochondrial DNA of Madeiran mice, suggests that Vikings also came to Madeira bringing mice with them, long before the island was colonized by Portugal. Quite extensive evidence for minor Viking raids in Iberia continues for the early 11th century in later narratives, including some Icelandic sagas and in northern Iberian charters. As the Viking Age drew to a close, Scandinavians and Normans continued to have opportunities to visit and raid Iberia while on their way to the Holy Land for pilgrimage or crusade, or in connection with Norman conquests in the Mediterranean. Key examples in the saga literature are Sigurdur Jorsalafari, king of Norway 1103–1130, and Ronvaldur Kali Karlsson d. 1158. Italy and Sicily. Around 860, Ermentarius of Noirmoutier and the Annals of St. Bertin provide contemporary evidence for Vikings based in Francia proceeding to Iberia and thence to Italy. 3 or 4 11th century Swedish runestones mention Italy, memorializing warriors who died in Langbardaland, the Old Norse name for southern Italy, Longobardia. It seems clear that rather than being Normans, these men were Varangian mercenaries fighting for Byzantium. Varangians may first have been deployed as mercenaries in Italy against the Arabs as early as 936. Later, several Anglo-Danish and Norwegian nobles participated in the Norman conquest of southern Italy. Harald Hardrada, who later became king of Norway, seems to have been involved in the Norman conquest of Sicily between 1038 and 1040, under William de Hauteville, who won his nickname Iron Arm by defeating the emir of Syracuse in single combat, and a Lombard contingent, led by Arduin. Edgar the Atheling, who left England in 1086, went there. Jarl Erling Skak won his nickname after a battle against Arabs in Sicily. On the other hand, many Anglo-Danish rebels fleeing William the Conqueror joined the Byzantines in their struggle against Robert Guiscard, Duke of Apulia, in southern Italy. Islamic Levant. The well-known Harald Hardrada would also serve the Byzantine emperor in Palestine, as well as raiding North Africa, the Middle East as far east as Armenia, and the island of Sicily in the 11th century, as recounted in his saga in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. Evidence for Norse ventures into Arabia and Central Asia can be found in runestones erected in Scandinavia by the relatives of fallen Viking adventurers. Several of these refer to men who died in Circland. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, the Norse referred to as Rus were viewed more as merchant warriors who were primarily associated with trade and business. Indeed, one of the only detailed accounts of a Viking burial come from Ibn Fadlan's account. At times, this trading relationship would break down into violence. Rus armadas raided in the Caspian on at least 3 occasions, in 910, 912, and 943. Eastern Europe. The Vikings settled coastal areas along the Baltic Sea and along inland rivers in Russian territories such as Staraya Ladoga, Novgorod, and along major waterways to the Byzantine Empire. The Varangians or Varyags Russian, Ukrainian, Varyagi sometimes referred to as Varyagins were Scandinavians who migrated eastwards and southwards through what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine mainly in the 9th and 10th centuries. Engaging in trade, colonization, piracy, and mercenary activities, they roamed the river systems and portages of Gardoriki, reaching and settling at the Caspian Sea and in Constantinople. The real involvement of the Varangians is said to have come after they were asked by the Slavic tribes of the region to come and establish order, as those tribes were in constant warfare among each other. Our country is rich and immense, but it is rent by disorder. Come and govern us and reign over us. The tribes were united and ruled under the leadership of Rurik, a leader of a group of Varangians. Rurik had successfully been able to establish a set of trading towns and posts along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, which were perfect for trade with the Byzantine Empire. Rurik's successors were able to conquer and unite the towns along the banks of the Volga and Dnieper rivers and establish the Rus Khaganate. Despite the distinction of the Varangians from the local Slavic tribes at the beginning, by the 10th century, the Varangians began to integrate with the local community, and by the end of 12th century, a new people, the Russians, had emerged. Iran and the Caucasus. Ingar the Far-Traveled led expeditions to Iran and the Caucasus between 1036 and 1042. His travels are recorded on the Ingar runestones. Around 1036, Varangians appeared near the village of Bashi on the Rioni River. The Georgian chronicles described them as 3,000 men who had traveled from Scandinavia through present-day Russia, rowing down the Dnieper River and across the Black Sea. King Bagrat Roman IV welcomed them to Georgia and accepted some of them into the Georgian army. Several hundred Vikings fought on Bagrat's side at the Battle of Sassarity in 1047. North Atlantic. Iceland. Iceland was discovered by Nadod, one of the first settlers on the Faroe Islands, who was sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands but got lost and drifted to the east coast of Iceland. Nadodr named the country Snaland Snoland. Swedish sailor Gardar Svevarsson also accidentally drifted to the coast of Iceland. He discovered that the country was an island and named it Gardarsholmi, literally Gardar's Islet, and stayed for the winter at Husavik. The first Scandinavian who deliberately sailed to Gardarsholmi was Floki Vilger Darson, also known as Atrafna Floki Raven Floki. Floki settled for one winter at Bardastrand. It was a cold winter, and when he spotted some drift ice in the fjords, he gave the island its current name, Island Iceland. Iceland was first settled around 870. The first permanent settler in Iceland is usually considered to have been a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarson. According to the story, he threw two carved pillars overboard as he neared land, vowing to settle wherever they landed. He then sailed along the coast until the pillars were found in the southwestern peninsula, now known as Reykjaneskagi. There he settled with his family around 874 in a place he named Reykjavik Bay of Smokes due to the geothermal steam rising from the earth. It is recognized, however, that Ingolfur Arnarson may not have been the first one to settle permanently in Iceland. That may have been Natfari, a slave of Gardar Svavarsson who stayed behind when his master returned to Scandinavia. Greenland. In the year 985, Erik the Red was believed to have discovered Greenland after being exiled from Iceland for murder in 982. 3 years later, in 986, Erik the Red returned with 14 surviving ships as 25 set out on the expedition. Two areas along Greenland's southwest coast were colonized by Norse settlers, including Erik the Red, around 986. The land was at best marginal for Norse pastoral farming. The settlers arrived during a warm phase, when short-season crops such as rye and barley could be grown. Sheep and hardy cattle were also raised for food, wool, and hides. Their main export was walrus ivory, which was traded for iron and other goods which could not be produced locally. Greenland became a dependency of the King of Norway in 1261. During the 13th century, the population may have reached as high as 5,000, divided between the two main settlements of Eystribygd Eastern Settlement and Vestribygd Western Settlement. The organization of these settlements revolved mainly around religion, and they consisted of around 250 farms, which were split into approximately 14 communities that were centered around 14 churches, one of which was a cathedral at Gardar. The Catholic Diocese of Greenland was subject to the Archdiocese of Nidaros. However, many bishops chose to exercise this office from afar. As the years wore on, the climate shifted. See Little Ice Age. In 1379, the northernmost settlement was attacked by the Skraeling Norse word for Inuit. Crops failed and trade declined. The Greenland colony gradually faded away. By 1450, it had lost contact with Norway and Iceland and disappeared from all but a few Scandinavian legends. North America. A Norwegian ship's captain named Bjarni Herjolfsson first came across a part of the North American continent ca. 985 when he was blown off course sailing to Greenland from Iceland. Subsequent expeditions from Greenland, some led by Leif Erikson, explored the areas to the west, seeking large timbers for building. In particular, Greenland had only small trees and brush. Regular activity from Greenland extended to Ellesmere Island, Skraeling Island, and Ruin Island for hunting and trading with Inuit groups. A short-lived settlement was established at Ox Meadows, located on the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland, Canada. There is also evidence for Viking contact with Native Americans. The Vikings referred to them as the Skraeling barbarians or puny weaklings. Fighting between the natives and the Vikings did take place, with the natives having the advanced weaponry of bows and arrows. However, trade by barter did also take place between them. This contact led to a mutual amazement of two peoples toward each other. However, the conflict between these two groups led to the Vikings' eventual evacuation of the area. The Greenlanders called the new found territory Vinland. It is unclear whether Vinland referred to in the traditionally thinking as Vinland wine land or more recently as Vinland meadow or pasture land. In any case, without any official backing, attempts at colonization by the Norse proved failures. There were simply too many natives for the Greenlanders to conquer or withstand, and they withdrew to Greenland. Svalbard. Vikings may have discovered Svalbard as early as the 12th century. Traditional Norse accounts exist of a land known as Svalbard, literally cold shores. This land might also have been Jan Mayen, or a part of eastern Greenland. The Dutchman Willem Barents made the first indisputable discovery of Svalbard in 1596. Genetic evidence and implications. Studies of genetic diversity have provided scientific confirmation to accompany archaeological evidence of Viking expansion. They additionally indicate patterns of ancestry, imply new migrations, and show the actual flow of individuals between disparate regions. However, attempts to determine historical population genetics are complicated by subsequent migrations and demographic fluctuations. In particular, the rapid migrations of the 20th century have made it difficult to assess what prior genetic states were. Genetic evidence contradicts the common perception that Vikings were primarily pillagers and raiders. A news article by Roger Highfield summarizes recent research and concludes that, as both male and female genetic markers are present, the evidence is indicative of colonization instead of raiding and occupying. However, this is also disputed by unequal ratios of male and female haplotypes, see below, which indicate that more men settled than women, an element of a raiding or occupying population. Mitochondrial and Y chromosome haplotypes. Y chromosome haplotypes serve as markers of paternal lineage, much the same as in DNA represents the maternal lineage. Together, these two methods provide an option for tracing back a people's genetic history and charting the historical migrations of both males and females. Often considered the purest remnants of ancient Nordic genetics, Icelanders trace 75% to 80% of their patrilineal ancestry to Scandinavia and 20% to 25% to Scotland and Ireland. On the maternal side, only 37% is from Scandinavia, and the remaining 63% is mostly Scottish and Irish. Iceland also holds one of the more well-documented lineage records, which, in many cases, go back 15 generations and at least 300 years. These are accompanied by one of the larger genetic records that have been collected by Decode Genetics. Together, these two records allow for a mostly reliable view of historical Scandinavian genetic structure, although the genetics of Iceland are influenced by Norse-British migration as well as that directly from Scandinavia. Common Y haplogroups. Haplogroup IM253, also known as haplogroup INE, is the most common haplotype among Scandinavian males. It is present in 35% of males in Norway, Denmark and Sweden, 40% of males within western Finland. It is also prominent on the Baltic and North Sea coasts, but decreases further south. Haplogroup Ronov is another very common haplotype in all of Western Europe. However, it is not distinctly linked to Vikings or their expansion. There are indications that a mutant strand, R165, cone. The mitochondrial cone haplotype is primarily an East Asia American haplotype that developed just prior to migration across the Bering Sea. This maternal haplotype, however, was found in several Icelandic samples. While originally considered to be a 20th century immigrant, a more complete analysis has shown that this haplotype has been present in Iceland for at least 300 years and is distinct from other cone lineages. This evidence indicates a likely genetic exchange back and forth between Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. Surname histories and the Y haplotype. There is evidence suggesting Y haplotypes may be combined with surname histories to better represent historical populations and prevent recent migrations from obscuring the historical record. Cis-282 Tyre. Cis-282 Tyre, or C282, Y is a mutation in the HFE gene that has been linked to most cases of hereditary hemochromatosis. Genetic techniques indicate that this mutation occurred roughly 60–70 generations ago, or between 600 and 800 CE, assuming a generation length of 20 years. The regional distribution of this mutation among European populations indicates that it originated in southern Scandinavia and spread with Viking expansion. Due to the timing of the mutation and subsequent population movements, C282Y is very prominent in Great Britain, Normandy, and southern Scandinavia, although C282Y has been found in almost every population that has been in contact with the Vikings.